December 20th, 1943. The air at 27,000 feet over northern Germany is thin enough to kill, and cold enough to freeze plasma instantly. Through the shattered skeleton of a B-17 Flying Fortress, the slipstream howls at 60 degrees below zero. This is the bomber known as Olde Pub, and by all laws of aerodynamics, it should be a smoking crater on the ground below. The rudder is shredded, swinging uselessly in the gale. The port elevator is completely disintegrated. The nose cone has been sheared off, turning the fuselage into a wind tunnel of deafening noise and flying debris. Inside, the crew is unconscious or wounded, their oxygen lines severed, their defensive guns silent. They are a carcass in the sky, limping through the most heavily defended airspace in history. Then the inevitable shape appears. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109, the apex predator of the Luftwaffe, slides into position 3 o'clock high. The ace pilot narrows his eyes, placing his thumb on the cannon trigger, aligning the iron sights on the crippled American bomber for the final easy kill stroke. But the trigger is never pulled, marking the beginning of a mystery that would remain buried for 40 years. To understand the miracle that occurred over the German coast, we must first understand the slaughter that preceded it. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had devolved into a contest of attrition that bordered on suicide. The United States 8th Air Force, operating out of the mist-shrouded airfields of East Anglia, was engaged in a daylight bombing campaign designed to break the back of the Third Reich. But the cost was becoming unsustainable. In October 1943 alone, during what crews called Black Week, the 8th had lost 148 heavy bombers in just 4 missions. That meant nearly 1,500 young Americans killed or captured in the span of a few days. The strategy was brutal but simple. Point-blank, daylight precision bombing. Unlike their British counterparts in the RAF, who bombed by night to hide under the cloak of darkness, the Americans flew by day. They believed that their northern bomb sites required visibility to destroy specific factories, rail yards, and refineries. To survive the swarms of German fighters, the B-17s flew in tight combat boxes, intricate three-dimensional formations designed to overlap their defensive machine gun fire, creating an impenetrable wall of lead. However, the Luftwaffe had solved the puzzle of the combat box. They had learned that head-on attacks, slashing through the formation at closure rates of 500 miles per hour, could break up the boxes before the American gunners could track them. They had upgraded their interceptors with heavier cannons and air-to-air rockets. By December, the average life expectancy of a B-17 crewman was measured in weeks. A tour of duty was 25 missions, but statistically, a crew was likely to be shot down before reaching their 15th. On the morning of December 20th, the target orders came down for mission 115. The objective was the industrial city of Bremen. This was not just a generic city raid. The target was the Focke-Wulf 190 factory. The Allied commanders were trying to strangle the Luftwaffe at its source by destroying the assembly lines that built the very fighters killing their men. The weather forecast was miserable. Heavy cloud cover and sub-zero temperatures. But the mission was a maximum effort. Every flyable B-17 and B-24 Liberator was ordered into the air. Among them, sitting on the tarmac at RAF Kimballton, was a brand new B-17F, tail number 423167. Its nose art, freshly painted, read, "Olde Pub." This mission would be the debut for the crew of Olde Pub. Commanding the aircraft was Second Lieutenant Charles L. Brown. Brown was a 21-year-old farm boy from West Virginia, soft-spoken and methodical, barely older than the high school students he had left behind. He had zero combat experience. His crew was equally green, 10 men who had trained together in the States, but had never seen a burst of flak or a German fighter in anger. They were assigned to the 379th Bomb Group, a unit that would eventually become one of the most decorated of the war. But on this frozen morning, they were just another rookie crew trying to keep their nerves in check as the engines coughed to life. As the massive formation clawed its way up through the overcast skies over the English Channel, the strategic situation facing them was dire. The Bremen mission required them to fly deep into the heart of the Reich's air defense network. The Germans had concentrated their anti-aircraft batteries, the dreaded flak, around key industrial centers like Bremen. These 88mm and 105mm guns could loft explosive shells over 30,000 feet, filling the sky with boxes of shrapnel designed to shred aluminum skin and human flesh alike. But the greater threat waited on the airfields of Holland and northern Germany. Waiting for the bombers was the Jagdgeschwader, the fighter wings of the Luftwaffe. Among those preparing to intercept was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. Unlike Brown, Stigler was no rookie. He was a veteran ace with 22 confirmed aerial victories to his name. A kill in the Luftwaffe was a strict metric. One engine shot out didn't count. The enemy plane had to be seen crashing or exploding. Stigler was a man of complex motivations. He had begun his career flying for Lufthansa before the war and had later served as an instructor, teaching young German pilots the art of survival. By late 1943, he had seen too many of his students die. He flew not out of fanaticism for the Nazi Party. Historians note he was a devout Catholic who had studied for the priesthood before finding his calling in aviation, but out of a duty to his country and his squadron mates. On this day, his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was sitting on the airfield, refueled and rearmed. He was one victory away from the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. One more bomber, just one more kill, and he would have the recognition he had fought years to achieve. As Olde Pub crossed the Dutch coast, the German radar network lit up. The trap was set. The rookie American crew was flying straight into a collision course with one of the Luftwaffe's deadliest veterans, in a sky that was about to turn into an inferno. To fully grasp the disparity of the coming encounter, we must strip away the nostalgia of black and white newsreels and look at the raw mechanics of 1943 aerial warfare. The B-17 Flying Fortress is often mythologized as an invincible tank in the sky. In reality, it was a fragile lattice of aluminum ribs wrapped in skin so thin you could punch a screwdriver through it. Its defense was not armor plate, but firepower. A standard B-17F bristled with roughly a dozen 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns. These weapons fired rounds the size of a human finger at 850 rounds per minute. When a formation fired in unison, they created a zone of death that no fighter pilot wanted to enter. But the B-17 had a fatal flaw. It was slow, lumbering at roughly 160 miles per hour under a full bomb load, making it a sitting duck if isolated. Opposing them was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. By 1943, this airframe was aging but lethal. Stigler's machine was a dedicated bomber killer. It was stripped of excess weight and up gunned. Crucially, it carried the Mk-108 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. German pilots called this the pneumatic hammer. One hit from a 30mm mine shell could blow a wing off a B-17. Stigler didn't need to spray bullets. He just needed to land 2 or 3 good hits to disintegrate a bomber. Then there was the third participant in this battle, the atmosphere itself. At 27,000 feet, the environment is biologically hostile. The temperature inside the unpressurized fuselage of Olde Pub hovered at 60 degrees below 0 Celsius. If a gunner removed his gloves to clear a jam, his skin would freeze to the metal instantly, tearing off the flesh when he pulled away. The crew wore electric heated suits, but these were notoriously unreliable. If the electrical system failed due to battle damage, as it soon would for Charlie Brown, the cold became a slow, creeping assassin, dulling reflexes and slowing the heart just as the enemy fighters began their dive. Beyond the machinery, a darker psychological game was at play in the cockpit of every German fighter. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was operating under a ruthless meritocracy, fueled by a point system. A pilot's worth and his chances of winning the coveted Knight's Cross was calculated by the wreckage he created. A single-engine fighter was worth 1 point, a twin-engine bomber 2, but a 4-engine heavy bomber like the B-17 was the ultimate prize, worth 3 points. It was big, dangerous game hunting. Franz Stigler had already amassed enough points to be considered an ace, but the Knight's Cross was the one decoration that still eluded him. He was statistically 1 kill away. Shooting down Olde Pub wasn't just a military objective. It was the final step in a personal quest for glory that had driven him for years. On the other side of the equation was the paralyzing anxiety of the American crew. For Charlie Brown and his men, the war wasn't about medals yet. It was about basic cognitive function. As they approached the German border, they were breathing pure oxygen through rubber masks. If a mask froze or a line snagged, a man would succumb to hypoxia, oxygen starvation, within minutes. The symptoms were insidious. A false sense of well-being, followed by confusion, unconsciousness, and death. There was no room for heroics when simply staying awake required total concentration. They were 10 men trapped in a vibrating aluminum tube, unable to communicate except through a crackling intercom, waiting for the first black puffs of flak to appear in the windshield. This psychological pressure cooker was about to explode. As the formation turned at the initial point, lining up for the bomb run over Bremen, the abstract fear of death was replaced by the deafening reality of it. The time for nerves was over. The city of Bremen lay ahead, and the German anti-aircraft gunners were waiting. 11:30 a.m., the world explodes. As Olde Pub initiates its bomb run over Bremen, the German flak batteries find their range. The sky, previously a dull grey, becomes a chaotic mosaic of black smoke and orange flashes. The first major blow lands before they even drop their payload. An anti-aircraft shell explodes directly in front of the aircraft, shattering the plexiglass nose cone. The sub-zero slipstream instantaneously blasts through the cockpit, turning the interior into a hurricane of freezing wind and noise. The temperature plummets to 60 degrees below zero, but this is only the prelude. Moments after bombs away, the real executioners arrive. A swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s from Jagdgeschwader 11 spots the damaged fortress. They dive. The attacks are coordinated and merciless. They slash through the formation, singling out Brown's bomber. 20-millimeter cannon shells tear through the aluminum skin like paper, detonating inside the fuselage. In the tail section, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode is the first to die. A cannon shell impacts the tail turret directly, decapitating the 19-year-old gunner. The same explosion shreds the rudder control cables and obliterates the port horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft shudders violently, lurching to the left. Up front, the situation is catastrophic. A shell pierces the number 2 engine, sending it into a violent runaway spin. Another round knocks out the number 4 engine, with half its power gone and drag increasing from the battle damage. Olde Pub can no longer hold its place in the formation. It begins to slide backward, dropping out of the protective combat box. This is the nightmare scenario every bomber crew dreads, becoming a straggler. As Brown fights the heavy control yoke, attempting to stabilize the dying giant, the German fighters circle back for the kill. They line up on the helpless bomber, firing pass after pass. The fuselage is turned into a sieve. Bullets shatter the radio room, wounding Sergeant Dick Pichut. In the waist, Sergeant Yelisanko is hit in the leg by shrapnel. The black blood freezes instantly in the cold. The damage report is physically impossible. The hydraulic system is gone. The electrical system is shorting out. The oxygen bottles have been punctured. Without oxygen at high altitude, Brown and his co-pilot Spencer Pinky Luke begin to succumb to hypoxia. Their vision tunnels. Their movements become sluggish. The B-17 enters a steep spiral dive, plummeting from 27,000 feet toward the Earth. The G-forces mount. The German fighters, seeing the bomber spinning out of control with one engine smoking and pieces of the tail falling off, assume the kill is finished. They break off and return to base. But Olde Pub refuses to die. Through a haze of semi-consciousness, Brown manages to wrestle the yoke back as the thicker air at lower altitude revives him. He pulls the bomber out of its death dive at barely 2,000 feet, leveling off just above the German treetops. The violent shaking settles into a grim, lopsided vibration. They are alone, deep in enemy territory, with 2 dead engines, 1 failing engine, and a fuselage so full of holes that daylight streams through the sides. On the ground at Jever Airfield, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler stands by his fighter, smoking a cigarette while his ground crew frantically refuels and rearms his Messerschmitt. He hears a strange, low rumble. Looking up, he spots a B-17 flying impossibly low, barely above the tree line, trailing a thick plume of black smoke. It is Olde Pub, limping home. Stigler tosses his cigarette, jumps onto the wing of his fighter, and scrambles into the cockpit. The engine roars to life. He doesn't even wait for the ground crew to finish securing the cowlings. He taxis out and lifts off, hungry for the kill that will earn him the Knight's Cross. The chase is short. The B-17 is crawling at 130 miles per hour. Stigler closes the distance in seconds. He positions his fighter directly behind the bomber's tail, the classic executioner's spot. He places his thumb on the trigger button. Through his gun sight, he sees the B-17's tail section. It is shattered. The tail gunner's enclosure has been blown open. Stigler can see the body of Sergeant Eckenrode slumped over the guns, his blood frozen in long red icicles streaking down the fuselage. Stigler's thumb hovers over the button, but he doesn't press it. He pulls his fighter closer, within 20 feet of the bomber. What he sees shocks him. The fuselage has been flayed open. Through the gaping holes in the skin, he can see the crewmen inside, huddled over their wounded, frantically trying to administer first aid. It isn't a machine anymore. It is a flying ambulance. A memory flashes in Stigler's mind. The voice of his mentor, Gustav Rodel, from years before in North Africa. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself. To Stigler, this B-17 is no longer a combatant. It is a parachute made of aluminum. To shoot them now would be murder. Stigler eases off the throttle and pulls alongside the cockpit of the bomber. Inside, Charlie Brown, struggling to keep the plane level, looks out his right window. He doesn't see a blur of motion. He sees the grey eyes of a German pilot staring back at him. Brown freezes. He expects the flash of muzzle fire. His co-pilot, Pinky Luke, screams, "Drop him! Drop him!" But the turrets are jammed or unmanned. They are defenseless. Stigler doesn't fire. Instead, he waves frantically. He points down, signaling them to land in Germany and surrender. Brown shakes his head. He refuses. Stigler then points east, toward neutral Sweden. It is a 30-minute flight to safety. Again, Brown shakes his head. He is flying west, to England, or he is dying trying. Realizing the American won't turn, Stigler makes a decision that could get him executed for treason. He decides to escort them. He stays tucked in close formation with the B-17. As they approach the Atlantic Wall, the heavily defended German coastline, Stigler knows the German flak gunners on the ground will track the silhouette of his Bf-109. They won't fire on one of their own. By flying wingtip to wingtip, he shields the American bomber with his own aircraft, providing safe passage through the wall of anti-aircraft fire. They clear the coast and head out over the open North Sea. The danger is past. Stigler looks at Brown one last time. He raises his hand in a sharp, crisp salute. Then he banks his fighter hard to the left and dives away, disappearing into the clouds, leaving Olde Pub alone over the grey water. The flight across the North Sea was a 250-mile agony. Olde Pub was no longer flying. It was slowly falling forward. The altitude dropped steadily. 500 feet. 200 feet. The North Sea, a graveyard for thousands of airmen, churned just below their wheels. Brown fought the yoke for nearly 2 hours, his muscles screaming, his hands frozen to the controls. Behind him, the crew bailed out water and threw everything non-essential overboard. Guns, ammo, armor plate, desperate to lighten the load. Miraculously, the coast of England appeared through the mist. They hadn't made it back to their home base at Kimballton. They didn't have the fuel or the altitude. Instead, Brown spotted the runway at RAF Seething, a fighter base near the coast. As he lowered the landing gear, he prayed the hydraulics would hold. They did. The bomber touched down, bounced once, and rolled to a stop. When the ground crews at Seething sprinted toward the aircraft, they stopped dead in their tracks. They had seen shot-up planes before, but they had never seen anything like this. The B-17 was a sieve. There were huge holes in the fuselage where the skin had simply been blown away. The nose was gone. The tail was hanging by a few twisted spars. It was physically impossible for the machine to be intact, yet there it sat, smoking on the tarmac. Brown and his surviving crew were rushed to debriefing. Adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of exhaustion. A frantic intelligence officer began questioning Brown. What happened? How did you survive the fighter attacks? Brown, still in shock, told the truth. He described the flak, the damage, and the death of Sergeant Eckenrode. And then he described the German fighter pilot. He told them about the escort. He told them about the salute. The room went silent. The intelligence officer stopped writing. He left the room and returned with a superior officer. They made Brown repeat the story. Then the order came down from the highest levels of the 8th Air Force Command, likely from Colonel Judas himself. "You are to tell no one," they ordered Brown. This event never happened. The logic was cold and absolute. The Allied commanders feared that if the story got out that a German pilot had shown mercy, it would damage the morale of the bomber crews. It might make them hesitate to kill the enemy. It might humanize the Nazis. In a war of total annihilation, there was no room for chivalry. Brown and his crew were sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial. The act of humanity was classified secret, buried in a file to gather dust. Across the channel, Franz Stigler landed his Bf 109. He climbed out of the cockpit, shaking. He too had a report to file. If he told the truth, that he had let a heavy bomber escape, he would be put against a wall and shot for treason. So, he lied. He reported that the B-17 had gone down over the sea. He claimed a probable kill, but never the confirmation. He washed the blood from his memory, rearmed his plane, and prepared to fly again the next day. The secret was safe on both sides of the English Channel. For 40 years, the incident over Bremen remained a ghost story. The war ended. Europe was rebuilt. The B-17s were scrapped and melted down into aluminum siding and soda cans. Charles Brown stayed in the Air Force, serving through the Cold War, and eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Franz Stigler survived the war, a statistical anomaly for a Luftwaffe pilot, in 1944, and immigrated to Canada in 1953, becoming a successful businessman in Vancouver. They lived parallel lives on opposite sides of a continent, separated by thousands of miles and a wall of silence. But Brown could not let the memory die. He was haunted by the image of the German pilot. Who was he? Why had he spared them? In his nightmares, Brown would see the fighter plane, but sometimes, in the dream, the pilot would pull the trigger. He needed closure. He needed to know if the angel in the cockpit was real or a hallucination born of hypoxia and trauma. In 1986, Brown began an active search. He attended reunions, scoured archives, and asked historians, but came up empty. Finally, he took a long shot. He placed an ad in a German newsletter for former fighter pilots, Jägerblatt. It was a simple inquiry, seeking the German pilot who escorted a B-17 out of Germany on December 20th, 1943. In Vancouver, Franz Stigler opened his newsletter. He saw the date. He saw the location. He saw the specific detail about the escort. He turned to his wife and said, "This is him. This is the one I didn't shoot." Stigler wrote a letter to Brown. He didn't just claim credit. He provided details only the pilot could know. He described the specific damage to the tail. He described the weather. He described the salute. When Brown read the letter, the shaking that had started in the cockpit 40 years earlier finally stopped. They arranged to meet in a hotel lobby in Seattle. The reunion was recorded on home video. Two old men, gray-haired and stooped, walked toward each other. They didn't shake hands. They collapsed into each other's arms, weeping uncontrollably. Stigler, the man who had been trained to kill Brown, whispered, "I love you, Charlie." In a conflict defined by industrial slaughter, where death was dealt by coordinates, bomb loads, and political ideologies, the encounter between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler stands as a defiant anomaly. It contradicts everything we are taught about the Second World War. We are taught that it was a war of annihilation, where the enemy was faceless and mercy was a weakness. But at 27,000 feet, stripped of the propaganda and the politics, two men looked across the wingtips and saw something other than a target. Franz Stigler risked a firing squad, not for strategic gain, but for a code of honor that predated the Third Reich, a belief that there is a line a human being does not cross, even in the hell of combat. The bond forged in that frozen sky lasted for the rest of their lives. For nearly 2 decades after their reunion, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler were inseparable. They called each other brother. They traveled across North America together, fishing, sharing meals, and telling their story to anyone who would listen. They had been enemies for a few minutes, but they were best friends for 20 years. In a final, poetic stroke of fate, the two men died in 2008, just months apart. They had flown their last mission together. Their story remains a testament to a profound truth, that while nations may declare wars, it is individuals who must fight them. And even when the world demands that we become monsters, the choice to remain human is always ours to make.